on what you said about our policies, American policies or Western policies during unipolarity and what they mean for the multipolar world we're now in. I think the best example of a foolish policy during unipolarity that's come back to bite us in multipolarity is NATO expansion, especially NATO expansion into Ukraine. As you know very, very well, in April 2008, we made the decision, the West made the decision, NATO made the decision to bring Ukraine into NATO. And we've doubled down on that decision at every point since then. And the consequences here are just disastrous for all concerned, as you were pointing out. But we had a great deal of hubris during the unipolar moment. And this is more true of the United States than it was of the Europeans. But the Europeans were willing to go along with the United States. This was especially true of the British. And we collectively thought that we could run the world, that we had the wind at our back. And if other countries didn't like it, we would just shove things down their throat. This is how we approach NATO expansion. We understood from the get go that the Russians were opposed to NATO expansion. But in 1999, we shoved it down their throat. In 2004, we shoved the second big tranche down their throat. And then we thought we could shove the third big tranche, which would include Ukraine and Georgia, down their throat in April of 2008. And of course, it didn't work out. And it is made for a terrible situation. One could argue a catastrophic situation in Europe in the multipolar era. But I just wanted to sort of add to what you said. All right, on Trump, a very interesting question. You want to remember when Trump comes into office, this is January 2017, his administration, in the very first year they are in power, introduces the word multipolarity into the national security dialogue in the United States. The word multipolarity is not present in the Obama administration. Um, and it's President Trump who talks about multipolarity. And they talk about the Chinese and the Russians as the other two great powers. Furthermore, Trump, when he comes into office, abandons engagement with China, which was a very liberal policy designed to make China rich and turn it into a liberal democracy on the assumption we would all live happily ever after. It's Trump who ends engagement and adopts containment in this multipolar world, as his administration describes it. Furthermore, as you remember, Trump wanted to have good relations with Russia, with Putin. And if he had succeeded at that, and we had had no NATO expansion into Ukraine, the United States and Russia would have much better relations today than exists. Now, what happened? What happened is that as a result of Russiagate and the power of the deep state, Trump ended up being every bit as antagonistic towards the Russians as his predecessors and his successors. And as we all know, he was the first president to provide offensive arms to the Ukrainians. So, what happened with the coming of President Trump to the White House in January 2017 is that we, in a very conspicuous way, moved into a multipolar world. Number one. Number two, we put a great deal of emphasis on containing China and abandoning engagement. But with regard to Russia, we continued to push the Ukraine situation to the point where it was guaranteed that the Russians were going to end up allied with the Chinese, which didn't make any sense. So that's the first Trump administration. Then we get the second Trump administration, which of course starts on January 20th of this year. We're clearly in a multipolar world now. There's just no doubt about that. And Trump is interested in containing China, apparently. And it looks like he's interested in improving relations with Putin and with Russia more generally. He looks like in the beginning that he's interested in doing in his second administration vis-a-vis Russia what he was unable to do in his first administration. But it doesn't work. He does it in such a ham-fisted way that he makes virtually no progress in settling the Ukraine war. And relations between the United States and Russia, uh, despite appearing better on the surface, are pretty much the same as ever. The Russians don't trust us at all. The Russians are clearly closely allied with the Chinese, and they understand full well that they should remain closely allied with the Chinese. Because the problem with President Trump is that he changes his mind every other day, and you can't trust him. The Indians found that out, as we discussed earlier. The Russians have found that out on countless occasions. They talk to him, they think they have an agreement, and then a couple days later, Trump changes his mind. So the end result of all this is that the Russians and the Chinese, as we were saying before, are as close together as ever. The Indians are now reasonably close to both the Russians and the Chinese because of Trump's foolish policies. So, in a very important way, Trump has good instincts, I think. In terms of his basic instincts on the nature of international politics and what our relationship should be with countries like Russia and China. Again, I think his basic instincts are correct. But in terms of execution, he gets a failing grade. And that's why the United States is in so much trouble today.
Well, it seems that all the NATO expansion, it made a lot of sense, I think, in the 1990s. Because if there is a unipolar distribution of power and one pursues this hegemonic peace where you don't have to take into consideration the security of your opponents, rather, you just make sure you're so dominant that it doesn't really matter what other countries like Russia thinks, then of course it makes sense to expand NATO because what this entailed was, well, strengthening the US role in Europe, but also recognizing if Russia would be within these NATO structures, it wouldn't be the same kind of institution that would bring the Americans into Europe. And again, Joe Biden, he made this comment in the Atlantic Council back, I think it was in 1997, where he said, "Oh, the Russians warned us that if we expand NATO, then they're forced to look towards China as a partner." And then he said, "Well, I told them, yeah, go ahead. While you're at it, if that doesn't work, go try to partner with the Iranians." And the whole room just bursts into laughter, like because America and the West was the only game in town, and they knew this, that the worst deal he gave to the Russians was the only deal on the table. And the U.S. Secretary of Defense under Clinton, William Perry, made a similar comment that yeah, everyone in the administration knew this would alienate the Russians, but it didn't really matter anymore because they were weak. So all of this kind of made sense when there's a unipolar distribution of power. But when expanding this to NATO, and now Russia has the ability to push back and fight, and indeed winning this proxy war against NATO, given the new distribution of power, which we kind of have to recognize, what is the way to rescue the situation now? Because this NATO expansion, which for me gave birth, was good to cement the unipolar moment from the 1990s and 2000s. It doesn't really make much sense anymore now that the Russians are capable of, again, winning on the battlefield, withstanding economic pressures, finding new international partners, strengthening China, which is now the main rival to the United States. What what does the political West do in this situation? Because it's um it's very hard to change course now. It seems.
I just want to go back to your comments on the decisions that were made in the 1990s, especially with regard to NATO expansion. Your rhetoric sort of implied that we were thinking in balance of power terms at the time. Uh, I think that people like Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, George Kennan, Paul Nitze, and a substantial number of other people, many of whom were quite hawkish during the Cold War, thought of NATO expansion in, I think, balance of power terms. In other words, they thought that if we expanded NATO, the Russians would react and we would be in real trouble. And the Russians, in their mind, would act according to basic realist logic. And that's why they opposed NATO expansion. But of course, they lost the fight. And the people who dominated the discourse, people like Anthony Lake, Strobe Talbot, and President Clinton himself, did not think in balance of power terms. It's very important to understand that we were not expanding NATO in the 1990s, in the first part of the 21st century, because we thought Russia was a threat. That kind of rhetoric is dominant in the West now. That was not our view in the 1990s, for sure. Bill Clinton thought that he could expand NATO and create this giant zone of peace that included both Eastern Europe and Western Europe. What he wanted to do was take those institutions that dominated in Western Europe and spread them eastward. He wanted to create a zone of peace, a Europe that was whole and free. He did not view this as anti-Russian. Clinton was fully aware that the Russians would be unhappy, but he thought that he could assuage their fears and that NATO could be expanded and we could live happily ever after. Michael McFaul, who was fully on board with this whole enterprise and was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow at one time, has told me that he told Putin on a number of occasions that NATO expansion was not a threat to Russia. It was not designed to cause problems for Russia. For Russia, it was designed to make Europe more peaceful. It was only after the crisis broke out on February 22nd, 2014, that we changed the rhetoric and the Russians became dangerous and NATO expansion had to happen to contain these evil Russians. But that's not what was driving thinking about NATO expansion before then. Again, it's very important to understand that this was the period of liberal hegemony. This is when we had these liberal ideas in our head that we thought should dominate how we thought about American foreign policy. And just to switch gears for a second here and drive my point home, you want to understand that the United States played a key role in turning China into a great power. We helped on purpose to fuel Chinese economic growth, allowing China to join the WTO in 2001, which both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration fully supported, really fueled Chinese growth in the early part of this century. And we were doing that on purpose because we thought that if China became really powerful, it would become a democracy. And because democracies don't fight each other and democracies live together happily, that this story would have a happy ending to it. That was our belief. And remember, I told you that it was President Trump, when he became president for the first time in 2017, he was the person who jettisoned or got away from engagement, this policy that was designed to make China rich. And what Trump did was he adopted containment. But we had a fundamentally different view of how to think about dealing with China before 2017. And it was a very liberal approach. It basically believed, let me put it differently, it was basically premised on the assumption that the world had changed and balance of power politics didn't matter anymore, and that the United States could live comfortably, peacefully with a really powerful China, right? And the same logic, again, applied with regard to NATO expansion. The Clinton people were not looking to pick a fight with Russia. As you know better than I do, Glenn, Russia was a military and economic basket case in the 1990s and early 2000s. There was no need to think about containing Russia back then, and that's not what they were doing. They were, in their minds, spreading this liberal regime that existed in Western Europe eastward, and were going to make Europe more peaceful. And of course, it all backfired. It backfired in East Asia. The United States created a peer competitor. Can you believe that? The United States purposely created a powerful China that's now a peer competitor. And in Europe, we pushed NATO expansion on the belief that this would lead to a more peaceful Europe, when it's had exactly the opposite effect. Now, this brings us to your question, sort of, what do we do now? I have no answer to that because uh, the elites who run Europe and the foreign policy establishment in the United States are deeply opposed to reaching any sort of accommodation with the Russians. And as you and I both know full well, the Russians are going to win this war. What exactly that victory looks like is hard to say, but the Russians are going to win. They're not going to lose. NATO, and this includes the United States and the Europeans, are not going to be happy about that at all. And you're going to have a fundamentally conflictual relationship, even if it doesn't involve shooting, between the West on one side, allied with Ukraine, what's left of Ukraine, and the Russians on the other side. So we're in trouble for as far as the eye can see.
Yeah, no, I don't doubt that there was genuine assumption, linked to the liberal assumptions about how the relationships would work out. Again, in the liberal theory, they assume that yeah, democracy leads to peace, economic interdependence leads to peace, shared institutions lead to peace. So with the economic growth of China, you have the middle class, they demand democracy. Now you have peace, economic interdependence between the US and China, peace. And of course, more integration of China into shared institutions, then also common rules, so the anarchy is reduced, also peace. Of course, in the if you looked at the world from their realist lens, a stronger China would, of course, unleash a direct competition between the United States and China. But the same logic also was flawed with Russia, though. That it was the argument that NATO was then just a democratic community. It was no longer aimed to contain Russia. So the Russians shouldn't be concerned. However, as soon as Russia began to push back, it immediately also called converted back to the Cold War containment objective, which we now see. So it's I guess what I'm missing is a bit of the in all of the West is some reflection on some of the wrong assumptions which were made, and some course correction, but I haven't really gone there yet. I did want to ask about Europeans though, because I can see, how the United States should reposition itself in the international system. That is, accommodate other centers of power. That is Russia, India, in order for not to push them too far over to the main adversary. But what do the Europeans do? Because they have been just linked to the United States intimately so since World War II. But in a multipolar system, the Americans have less interest in Europe. They have other priorities. The world isn't Eurocentric anymore. So how how should the Europeans act? Because the U.S. has been important for the past 80 years. It's been a pacifier within Europe to prevent us from going at each other's throat. But it's also been a very important actor for the Europeans to remain relevant after World War II as well. So, um, what is the what is the pathway? How does Europe, I guess, adjust to a multipolar world? Because bipolarity, we had to be with U.S. It protected us from the Soviets. The unipolar world order, it was we had a great ambition. The EU was supposed to be collective use our collective bargaining power. We're supposed to, be the other leg. The collective hegemony of the political West was supposed to be U.S. and Europe, again, enduring relevance in the world. But in a multipolar world where the Americans are leaving, and what does the European do? Because we haven't really been, as you said before, in a position like this since before the Second World War.
I just want to repeat what you said in slightly different words because it's so important what you said. The Cold War was focused on Europe. For anybody who did the Cold War, the Central Front in Europe was the centerpiece of the conflict. So Europe mattered enormously to the United States during the Cold War. And East Asia took a back seat. Uh, and then came unipolarity. And the United States and the Europeans were joined at the hip during unipolarity. We stayed in Europe. As you pointed out, Glenn, we remained the American pacifier. And of course, NATO expansion, if you think about it, just means more American involvement, not less American involvement, because the Americans are now concerned with uh, extending the pacifier over the eastern half of the continent, not just keeping it over the western half. And then unipolarity goes away, as you say, and we're in multipolarity. And the consequences for Europe are enormous. I'm repeating what you said because it's important that viewers just understand what's happened here. Europe just doesn't matter that much for the United States. And let me just say a few words about that. Uh, First of all, almost everybody agrees, certainly in the national security establishment here in the United States, that the principal threat the United States faces comes from China. And that necessitates a pivot to Asia, which means a pivot away from Europe. And that's a momentous decision. As I like to tell people, for the entire history of the United States, up until about 2017, Europe was the most important area of the world for us outside of the Western Hemisphere. Europe was always more important than Asia. And that was because the most powerful states in the system, besides the United States, were in Europe, not in East Asia. Uh, Nazi Germany was far more of a threat to us than Imperial Japan was. Well, that world has gone away. The principal threat that we face is in East Asia. So East Asia, by definition, is more important to us than Europe is. This is the first time that that's ever happened. And of course, this is what underpins the pivot to Asia. And this is really significant for Europe. Second point I'd make, which is closely related to this, is the third great power in the system is Russia. And despite all this crazy talk in Europe about how Russia's going to conquer all of Ukraine, then conquer Eastern Europe, and pretty soon after that, it's going to be on the beaches of Dunkirk. This is just craziness. This is not going to happen. Russia's having a tough time conquering the eastern one-fifth of Ukraine. The idea that this is the second coming of the Wehrmacht, they're going to conquer all of Ukraine and then move further westward, it's just not a serious argument. Um, so there's no reason for the United States to be in Europe from the perspective of great power politics. Should we be in Europe to contain Russia? No, because there's no serious threat that Russia is going to dominate Europe. And in fact, we were foolish to expand NATO past 2004 because we created this crisis, which is not in our national interest. It's dragged us into Europe. In fact, the United States should be pivoting to Asia. So you have this situation where the United States has no real incentive to stay in Europe because East Asia is a much more important theater. And the Chinese are, there are many Chinese, they have formidable military forces, and the United States is going to need all the help it can get trying to contain China. So staying in Europe does not make a lot of sense. This is disastrous from a European perspective because the United States has served as a pacifier. The Europeans, for good reasons, I don't blame the Europeans at all, don't want us to leave. Because as long as you have Uncle Sam in Europe, NATO is intact, you have the pacifier in place. And nobody has to worry about Germany rearming, right? And nobody has to worry about the Russians because the Americans are there. But you take the Americans away, and it's a very different situation because Europe is then on its own. And it quickly becomes apparent that Europe is not a political entity by itself, that Europe is a collection of different states that have all sorts of collective action problems, that have all sorts of different security concerns. If you're Spain, you think about Ukraine very differently than if you're Poland, obviously. And then if you factor in history, relations between countries like Germany and France, Germany and Denmark, and especially Germany and Poland come to the fore. And the United States is not there to act as a pacifier and solve collective action problems and smooth ruffled feathers. So, from a European perspective, the key is to try to keep the Americans in. And that would be tough to do under any circumstances because of the structural imperatives here. The fact that East Asia is so important to the United States, but it's especially tough because Trump is the president. And Trump basically loathes the Europeans. The Europeans, of course, understand this. They don't talk much about it because they understand that you have to constantly kiss up to President Trump and be nice to him and so forth and so on. But they understand that he loathes them and he would be perfectly happy to put an end to NATO and get out of Europe. So it's going to be very difficult for the Europeans moving forward to keep that pacifier in place.